My presentation today is entitled Analyze This: How RTA and Integrated Reservoir Studies Have Revolutionized Our Understanding of Unconventional Reservoirs. I'd like to begin by introducing our team. We do this every session. This is now our third breakfast that we've hosted this November, the previous two being conducted by our director, David Anderson, and Adam Stardiuela, most recently last week. We always take a minute just to introduce ourselves to the new audience members that are tuning in for these sessions. So who is Anderson Thompson? Where did we come from? Where did we start? We founded a department, a business unit within NCS Multistage in January of 2015. And over the course of what's mostly the last couple years, we've had a lot of learnings as part of doing rate transient analysis, which is our core area of competency for Dave and I, the founders of the business unit, and through the integrated studies that we've done through the involvement of science and data from the geosciences, namely Adam Stardiuela, who presented last week, and our newly hired exploration geologist, John Foster. We're also partnered up with completions engineers to assist us in doing fracture modeling design and other aspects of completion engineering as it integrates into our workflows. So we're really a small integrated asset team within our service company that go around to support customers. And the customers vary. We partner from small, junior to major oil and gas operating companies and investors. We've recently taken on trying to promote ourselves to create a market by servicing the financial sector. Our team has world-class expertise in unconventional reservoir characterization and production forecasting, and as production forecasting tied to defendable reserves. We have broad international basin experience. We've specialized most recently in the last 2 years, as a lot of other people have, in the Permian, looking at Midland and Delaware subbasins, looking at Wolfcamp Sprayberry type stuff. Also Eagle Ford, Bakken, Marcellus, and Montney from over the years, where we've developed our skills. The objectives of today's talk, at a very high level, the first is to explain how rate transient analysis has evolved in the last decade. I'm sure some of you have been in this industry for a really long time and have seen what RTA has evolved to, especially over the last 5 or 6 years. So we're going to get into some of the latest features and how we've used those in our workflows. Also show how rate transient analysis can be used to understand reserves and identify workover candidates and make better field development decisions. And by field development decisions, I'm really meaning optimized well spacing, trying to find the right landing depth, optimized stage spacing, things like that. And also, we need to demonstrate the value of RTA as the cornerstone of an integrated reservoir characterization study, and we're going to do this using field examples. And I say using it as a cornerstone. I think what we're doing here is, if not unique, it's certainly not commonplace from our experience, where rate transient analysis is really at the forefront of integrated study work. We're going to get into, like halfway into this presentation, introducing you to our simplified integrated workflow and what that looks like. And we're very excited about it, so I can't wait to show you. So in keeping with the Hollywood movie theme, because this breakfast series is all in keeping with Hollywood movie titles, the first being The Wolf of Wall Street, the second being The Odd Couple, this one being Analyze This, we're breaking our case studies out into soundtracks. And so the first soundtrack, side A, is going to be featuring case studies that are just featuring rate transient analysis alone studies. Of course, this comes with some interpreted petrophysics, because that's part of how to do our RTA, which I'll get into in a few introductory slides. But let's talk about the first 5 case studies that we're going to focus on this morning. The first is completion effectiveness, how RTA can be used to identify wells that are better, more effectively completed than others. And we're going to be doing this by looking at a case study in the Eagle Ford that was introduced at ERTEC in San Antonio last year in a paper. The second is going to be benchmarking well performance. We're often challenged to compare well A to well B, where well A and B are drilled differently and fracked differently. How can we use rate transient analysis to objectively normalize these wells so that we have more of an apples-to-apples comparison? The third is identifying pitfalls. In this particular case study, costly drilling pitfalls, avoidable drill locations that turn out to be probably a negative net present value when it's all said and done. That's in the Cardium. The fourth is diagnosing well issues. looking at well performance data and looking at rate and pressure responses and being able to identify if wells have uplift potential. Diagnosing sick or unhealthy wells that we might be able to solve with a clean out or a simple workover. And the fifth is well production normalization, and we're going to be looking at the Sprayberry for that example. So I think we have to start, for some of our audience members that aren't as familiar with rate transient analysis, just to go through some of the basics. Basic concept number one is often the reservoir signal is either contained in the rate or the flowing pressure data. And of course, at a lot of companies, we just look at production rate histories, particularly if it's a pumping well oil field, and we really don't know what the bottom hole flowing pressure is. In this particular illustration, though, we can see that there's a consistent response in flowing pressure with rate. As pressure goes down at the bottom of the well, the production rate goes up. I mean, a fairly simple concept. But these are the concepts that we're applying with all the analysis techniques and models that we use. Why do we use rate transient analysis? Well, I mentioned the first, one of the things that really drove our background and the popularity of RTA within the reserves evaluation community is because it can provide a very defensible audit trail, because it is coupled to basic petrophysical parameters and volumetrics, and captures the bulk well performance trends and understands the production drivers. So in that sense, it's a very practical application for coming up with a fairly defensible set of B values, if you will. It's certainly really great, too, when you don't have a lot of flow rate history. So if you've got limited amount of data, it's a very good objective performance indicator, better than early metrics like a 30-day IP rate. As I mentioned before in the case study, it's great for determining completion effectiveness, which it does using a couple bulk performance parameters. It can be used to identify infill potential. This is certainly what would capture the attention of the investment community, being able to identify if wells could be put closer together or we could find targets for infill opportunities and new drill locations. Also for reservoir surveillance, as I mentioned before, diagnosing if a well is sick or unhealthy, RTA can reveal that, which we'll show you in one of the case studies. And it's minimal cost. We're collecting this data anyway. It's a shame not to take advantage of something that's a very cost-effective solution to learn a lot about the reservoir. The simplified rate transient analysis workflow, which was introduced in David Anderson's Distinguished Lecturer Tour, which was hosted about a year and a half ago, is presented here. Here we can see it broken into 4 basic categories. We start with diagnostics, or what a lot of others would call data diagnostics, which is just looking at the empirical trends of the data, trying to see if we can capture some simple takeaways for flow regimes and productivity issues. It's very nice because you can look at the data with a very large well count and you can extract some basic information that would be of value to reserves and even to, as the reservoir engineering goes, being understand basics about flow regime transitions. Then we get into the interpretation component and analysis. By analysis, I mean the analysis techniques are also very practical in the fact that they can be applied quickly to a large well count. These would include straight line methods like square root time plots or specialized linear flow plots that use more sophisticated time functions, and type curve techniques, and also flowing material balance analysis. So these are a combination of straight line analysis methods and type curves. The modeling and history matching component to follow, this is where we spend the bulk of our time, quite frankly, particularly in complex multi-phase fluid environments, which seems to be very popular these days, particularly in the Permian. We spend a lot of time either doing analytical or numerical modeling. We do this to validate the interpretations from our analysis. In that sense, the results from analysis are the feedstock for our initial iteration for our models. And once we get a very good history match or a set of series of different reservoir descriptions with good history matches, which we can either do deterministically or probabilistically, we then take those with a characterized reservoir and we do our production forecasts. Forecasts that are rolled up into economics packages to generate cash flows and to really understand the optimization of the field. Let's speak a little bit about forecasting and how RTA fits in. So I built a little triangle, which is a real simplified way of looking at life when it comes to looking at doing a production forecast in an EUR in a single well. At the bottom, this is the most popular technique in the world. It's traditional decline curve analysis and also other empirical rate time analysis tools that would address unconventionals. Particularly, I'll mention the Antoine method, stretched exponential decline, and power law exponential. All these methods that were introduced in the last 6-7 years. These things are terrific because they can be applied to a large well count and they can be done fairly efficiently. Moving up the ladder from that, it doesn't take that much more effort to incorporate the flowing pressure response. With what we could do just using basic wellhead data, or if we had wellbore schematics, we can convert these surface wellhead pressures to a sand face without too much trouble. This would be particularly advantageous for companies that are looking to do just a little bit better than rate decline, especially when you're dealing with highly overpressured, rate-restricted programs where you can't decline a well that's constant rate very easily without applying a rule of thumb. So that pressure information is great. We're seeing more companies do this. Now, going up the ladder from that for an even more accurate answer, RTA, which is very commonly known as being a rate pressure time analysis method, well, it incorporates a little bit more. It incorporates some basic petrophysical considerations and some volumetrics. Volumetrics that can be given to us from our field development strategy, such as well spacing or drainage area. So we believe that this is a very practical approach for getting a really good answer without having to go up to the top of the pyramid, which is going to take us a much longer time to get an EUR or an understanding of reserves across the field, which is what we've generally categorized as reservoir simulation. And by that category, I don't just mean reservoir simulation. I mean bringing it all together. So this would be the product of a fully integrated study that would include things like bringing in the surveillance information like microseismics, fiber optics, tracer data, you name it, frac modeling, the whole bit. So let's start with 3 slides that get the basics of RTA. I apologize. I recognize so many people in the room that are my friends here that know RTA really well. So I'll try to get through this quickly, but I also want to make sure I do a reasonable job of introducing it to the new crowd. The basics of RTA is that you've got a following set of inputs. I mentioned the petrophysical parameters. You're looking at about a half a dozen parameters that we need. The basics are initial reservoir pressure, which is a critical one, which we can get from a DFIT in an unconventional play, along with the basics, porosity, saturation, net pay, and considerations for the fluid properties. So if it's an oil play, we need bubble point and API gravity. For gas play, we need gas gravity and dew point if it's a condensate play. So there's not too much involved, and if we don't know the numbers, we can approximate using experience and using some of the data diagnostics that are available that what the data tells us, maybe some insights about saturation pressure. The well schematic is just a glorified calculator for taking a wellhead pressure, which we always have, and trying to convert that to a sand face condition. In an ideal world, Dave and I have been promoting for years the value of having bottom hole flowing pressure measurements so that we don't have to do these calculations, but the fact remains that most wells just offer us wellhead data. And then, of course, the glory of the production data, which is all 3 phases, oil, water, gas, or condensate for gas wells, along with the flowing pressure data. And once we have all of this, we've got the ingredients for making RTA. And this is the product for the analysis. We've got showing here a type curve analysis plot where a type curve is well, essentially it's the dimensionless representation of an analytical solution of a reservoir description using dimensionless parameters typically shown on a log-log plot, as we can see here. And the idea is that if we can fit a type curve through the data, that this may give us an indication of what the reservoir description would look like, contingent that we know something about the well reservoir geometry to begin with. The flowing material balance analysis, which is the first of the straight line techniques to the bottom left-hand corner here, this gives us an indication of contacted volume in place for unconventionals. For conventionals, this would give you a very good idea of OOIP or OGIP. For unconventionals, it's a moving target. As the data updates, it keeps projecting to a larger volume. Usually our interpretation is that off the flush production for a shale well, we would indicate that is what we would call an SRV as we stretch our use of the language a little bit. But that's a fairly useful tool and fairly commonly adopted at this point in time. The linear flow specialized plot comes in many shapes and forms, from square root time plot analysis, which is just 1 over q versus square root time, to a normalized like delta p over q versus square root time, to more sophisticated time functions. You're seeing an example of that here. But really what it is to diagnose flow regime to make sure that we're seeing most likely linear flow from any fractured well to start, and then a transition. And it's in that transition that we really start to do our interpretation and infer what's going on. The linear flow specialized plot values can be used to characterize completion effectiveness, which I'm going to get into shortly. Modeling is, like I said, this is our bread and butter. This is where we spend most of our time. This is the time it spends to history match. And by history matching, what we're doing is we're specifying a reservoir description, and we're changing the parameters that go into the model to either do a history match on the pressure response while we use the production rate, or we use the flowing pressure response to history match the hydrocarbon rate, the gas or the oil rate. So the idea here is that if the model can be adjusted so that we have a combination of parameters that make sense, and we can history match the field performance trends or the well performance trends, then we've got a reservoir description that we think is permissible, that it's valid. And we all know here in this room that there's a whole bunch of different history matches, combinations of reservoir descriptions that match the data. And for this reason, that's really why the value of the integrated reservoir studies is what it is. By bringing in other data and information, we sort of hone in on what that reservoir description is in a simplified way so that we can use it in our engineering workflows for field development decisions. And so once you've characterized a reservoir, of course, you can forecast the well, and then you can get your cash flows. So the next slides I'm going to show are getting right into the case studies. Track number 1, completion effectiveness, looking at things like conductivity and effective frac area. This is, again, this is something Dave presented. It's a paper that he wrote, a 3-well pad for an operating company in the Eagle Ford. And RTA in this particular paper last year was used to understand well performance drivers and completion effectiveness. The study shows an infill well, which is the middle well that sits between a couple plug and perf wells, and we'll get into the characteristics of the completion in the next slide. And it comes on with really, really bad flush production. I mean, low rate, low flowing pressure. It did not look like a strong well candidate just by looking at those basic performance metrics. However, the study will show that with very limited production data, rate transient analysis revealed that that infill well suffered from a very significant apparent skin damage or low apparent fracture conductivity term, and it ends up that it's a much bigger SRV and therefore has a much bigger EUR to go with it. So I'm throwing out a lot here. I want to make sure I'm clear about defining completion types, just for the people in the audience that may not be familiar, particularly with a new term that's been in the industry for the last few years, which is the pinpoint completion. So when we compare completion technology, especially for those of us that have got a lot of experiences in the lower 48, because we see a lot of completion types up here in Canada, is that it's ubiquitous that the incumbent completion type is the plug and perf style completion for most basins, most ultra-tight plays. The plug and perf is a limited entry system as depicted in the bottom left-hand cartoon here, and it has advantages and disadvantages. One of its disadvantages is that it's a limited entry system that has several perforation clusters within an individual stage typically. Usually the perforation cluster count is anywhere between 3 and 6 clusters. And by having multiple entry points in the system as we pump our stage is that the sand and the frac fluid can take whatever path it so chooses. And oftentimes as a result of this completion configuration, it can pinch out certain clusters, and it can take other clusters with all the sand and water. So it creates a very non-uniform reservoir description. It lacks control. The pinpoint completion, on the other hand, is a single point entry system which can be achieved either through cuts or sleeves, And in these generally, when we say pinpoint, mean a cemented liner system. And cemented liners really so that we have better control over fracture placement, initiation. It's not a perfect system, but it's, you know, in terms of best in class for fracture placement, it would be considered that. The study area is here. We have 3 wells that are spaced at 700 feet apart, so that you can see where the infill well is in green, landed in between the 2 blue circles. This is a gas condensate, a rich gas condensate part of the Eagle Ford. The production of the pad is illustrated here. Here we can see the performance of all 3 wells, the original parent plug and perf wells, which offset that infill. And you can see their production rate histories in red and their flowing pressures in black, and their condensate yield in the green presented in the middle. After about a year of production, you can see that infill come in, and you can see as it comes in, it disturbs the performance, the gas rate history in particular of those 2 plug and perf wells. When we normalize production, so we start looking at all these wells at time 0 so that we can compare them, we can see what I was saying at the beginning of the case study, that the well did not IP as well as the plug and perfs, that the flowing pressure also was low. It certainly didn't look very promising to begin with. But given a very limited amount of data on that infill well, which is the pinpoint, we can see that the reason why it suffers out of the gate is a very large y-intercept here on this linear flow specialized plot, which is indicative of an apparent skin term. And a skin term is like a downhole choke. It really restricts flow, and as a result causes poor out of the gate performance. But the slope of the line is the most revealing, and the slope of the line, which is trying to characterize the linear flow segment of performance, the more shallow the better. The more shallow that line is, the more effective frac area we're creating, assuming that permeability for this section or this pad is a constant. So in that sense, it has more effective frac area. Also, in terms of the stimulated reservoir volume or contacted oil in place, or gas in place, I should say, for a gas well, we're seeing that those plug and perf wells are projecting to a volume that's roughly 50% of what that infill pinpoint well has contacted. And that infill well, of course, has half the production history of the other wells. So it's truly a strong performer, and therefore it explains why its decline characteristics aren't as sharp. It's not declining as steeply. So that gives you a good sense of how we use RTA to understand completion effectiveness, where we're just looking at some basic analysis. The next case study is benchmarking performance. We'll start by looking at the Bone Spring in the Delaware Basin. The objective here, and this is the very first, one of the first big projects that Dave and I started when we started at NCS Multistage, is that our objective was to compare pinpoint technology to the incumbent plug and perf design. And most of you who are familiar with NCS Multistage understands that they are a very popular vendor of pinpoint technology. So we were brought in at a series of projects studying the impacts of completion type from one well to another, and using our skill sets in rate transient analysis to objectively identify performance issues. So in this study, we looked at 6 sections where each of the sections had both completion types. This is just an example of a single section, just to keep the message short and sweet. We chose a small area in order to limit the geological variations in conducting this study. And we used we had control variables. And by this I mean we didn't want to compare wells that could have well performance effects as a result of wells with different azimuth or different landing depth. So we made sure to bin things appropriately. We studied the 1 plug and perf well in red in the bottom, and the 2 pinpoint wells that came on stream a few years later, the upper left-hand part of the section. The well spacing was 4 wells per section in this case. The plug and perf well was used to characterize the reservoir, and it was treated as the benchmark model because it had the most data. The benchmark model could be whatever well you want, but we typically choose the one that has the most performance history. In this case, what the well was assigned to drain was not uniform. You can see that the well, with respect to the acreage that it's assigned to drain, was a little non-uniform. So, but we can take that into account through modeling. And you can see we've got a really good history match through the flowing pressures indicated in the bottom left-hand plot as the brown line, which is the model response, goes through the data points. In the top right-hand plot, it might be hard to see, but this is a plot of rate versus cum, and the data points, the red dots, are how the well actually performed, and the green scratchy stuff through it that matches it is the model response for cum. So really this is just demonstrating that the final cumulative production matches the simulated. We have a good history match, and we've also presented a linear flow specialized plot, call it a square root time plot type curve, if you will, through the data. Now, once we've characterized the rock, now we can play our what-if scenarios. And this is how we do our benchmark. We look at the very first pinpoint well, and that first pinpoint well had a couple stages or a few stages that we couldn't achieve breakdown. Maybe there was a screen out or something, I'm not sure. But for whatever the reason, those stages were skipped. And yet, we can see that the prediction of our previous reservoir characterization would suggest that where the flowing pressures should have been on this well was indicated by that brown line that you can see there in the image in the bottom left. That brown line is where the pressure should be, but the data actually outperforms that. The data, or the dots that are sort of shaded off in light gray, that's where the well actually performed, in the sense that higher pressure means the well outperformed its type curve expectations. So this could be attributed to a few factors, but this is how we sort of narrow in on the impact of completion type, or maybe lateral stimulation efficiency, if we want, or effectiveness, if we want to think of it that way. So the pinpoint outperformed the plug and perf counterpart by 22,000 barrels of production over the first 8 months. Now let's look at the pinpoint well number 2. Following the same procedure and accounting for its geometry, we can see that the model pretty much predicted what the well would do. In this case, there was no advantage of completion type. That once properly normalized, these wells look very similar, sort of apples to apples. So our next case study is going to be called Identifying Pitfalls, Costly Drilling Mistakes. This is an overview in the Cardium, Canadian oil play. It's a 4-well study. The first well in the study is an old vertical well drilled in 2008. And then 3 horizontal wells get spud between 2010 and 11. RTA was used to understand the impact of well interference from the producing offsets prior to drilling the well in 2011. The study is going to demonstrate the value of using RTA to avoid costly mistakes. So here's the case study. There's your vertical well. There's your first horizontal well. There's your second in 2010. And the operator drilled a well right smack dab in the middle. At the time of the analysis, for the data that we had, using a very rough, crude approximation of region or radius of investigation, we can see that there's an obvious drainage area overlap with these wells. This can be indicated diagnostically in the analysis plots of rate transient analysis. Here we can see in the flowing material balance in the bottom left-hand corner that there is an interference effect indicated in the data at exactly the same time when the new well came on stream. And that's indicated by the data coming off that straight line and hooking down. Analogously, on the type curve analysis to the right-hand side, we can see productivity loss exhibited in the data as we come off that type curve and we're no longer on unit slope. So in this case, the RTA could identify this quite quickly. Numerical modeling also reveals the same thing. This shows, using a far more rigorous approach that can account for multi-phase flow effects, because of course the previous work was done analytically using single-phase liquid compressibility assumptions. This accounts far more rigorously for the data, but we can see the story is the same. That at the time that the new well was spud, we lose our history match, our productivity starts to suffer. And at that point, we can look at what the average, of an approximation of what the average reservoir pressure should be at that point for a quarter section. And that is initial reservoir pressure that's roughly a third of what the field was to start. So going from, say, 3,000 pounds to 2,000 pounds, something like that. Now looking at that horizontal well, the latest well that was drilled that was causing this problem in the vertical well and in the other horizontal wells as well, that it had 3.5 years of production history when we looked at it, because it was a 2011 well, and its EUR was only 21,000 barrels, despite the fact it was a 10-stage completion in good rock. The RTA interpreted pressure depletion from the offset well production is something that could have potentially prevented this drill location. To show some more features of RTA, if we just looked at the single vertical well type curve analysis to the left, I showed previously what that interference diagnostic would look like. Doing multi-well analysis, performing that and accounting for production for both wells, trying to compete for the same hydrocarbon in place, we can see that the methods allow us to correct for this behavior, which validates the fact that they are stealing the same production. And so this is more of a post-mortem tool, but in that case, but this was probably an avoidable mistake. Track 4, diagnosing well issues. So here the patient is the gas well and the doctor is an RTA engineer. This is going to show what it looks like if you're analyzing your gas wells back home and you're trying to history match flowing pressure given your producing gas rate. This is the best history match achievable with the conditions or constraints that were provided for initial reservoir pressure and for calculated sand phase pressure. It doesn't get a better match than this, and it's not a good match. So what is the data telling us that we need to know? In this case, we've got an error percentage of over 50% as our best history match available. And look at how good that data looks. That's textbook. It couldn't look any nicer. Dry gas well data often looks like this. And you can see in the buildup response that I've highlighted here, you know, the model is far out shooting the actual observed buildup. So what's going on? Well, a lot of this can be detective work where you use RTA as forensic science, and this relates to the theory of percentage drawdown. Our belief is that a lot of our wells are higher drawdown than they actually are. When we only have rate-time relationships, we have no way of diagnosing the health of a well. To whether there's pressure restrictions downhole, whether there's operational issues, particularly with pumping wells. If the pumps aren't working efficiently, how would you ever know? There are methods to do that, but this is a real practical, simple way of doing it. In this case, we believe that we're high drawdown, meaning small changes in flowing pressure shouldn't have any impact on the effect in a significant way on the producing gas rate. But in fact, in this example, we're seeing that. If we lower initial reservoir pressure or we increase bottom hole flowing pressure, we can get a history match that looks like this. We can come up with a 1% error, changing very little, which tells us that this well is not as high drawdown as we thought it was. We had discussions over initial reservoir pressure and whether that could be validated. In this case, it was a lot of evidence to support the PI. Therefore, there was something going on in the bottom of the well that was causing a pressure restriction. And in this case, this well, I believe, had jewelry left behind. They could be unmilled out ball seats. It could be a number of issues. That certainly might not be the issue, but a variety of issues could cause this. Now, what if, well, I'll get there. I first want to take a look at the percentage drawdown plotted through time is what it looks like. We thought we were in purple at 90%. We're probably closer to 60% drawdown. This well has performance uplift potential. This is just an example of different images in a wellbore that could be causing delta Ps, that could be causing this observed back pressure effect and this lower drawdown percentage that we're producing this well at. It can get really ugly down there, and of course we rarely have these images, so we don't always know. But if we see this in the RTA, if you diagnose a number of candidates where this is a problem, that would be your candidate list that you might want to go back and maybe run a camera, diagnose the issue, because this is low-hanging fruit if we can do a clean out to solve a problem or do a very cost-effective workover. The potential of upside in terms of accelerating reserve recovery or even changing EURs can be done in RTA. So we can just remove that pressure restriction to see what the performance upside would be. And here we can see in the red series where the well is headed, and in the purple or magenta series that what it would look like to remove that pressure restriction tomorrow and see what we could realize in terms of production on this well. So the last track that we're going to present here for RTA studies by themselves is production normalization. And we're going to start by doing a case study in the Sprayberry. And we're looking at 4 plug-and-perf horizontal oil wells here. 1 was from operator A, and 3 were from operator B. The operator B wells, all of them, were better than operator A. And operator A wanted to know why. So we were tasked to use our RTA and rigorously normalize the rock, fluid, completion, and well properties, which are all possible through modeling. The study is going to demonstrate that the differences in the well performance between operators A and B can be entirely explained by different lateral lengths and frac densities. If we were just to take a look at the performance of these wells as we compare them, and we just normalize per lateral foot, per stage, per proppant pumped, we wouldn't have come out with the same conclusions. And that's what a lot of operators do in order to compare wells A to B. In this case, you're going to see that RTA demonstrates that it's going to do a far better job of that. So we'll look at all the production histories as illustrated using a plot of cum versus time. And here we can see the operator A well being the underperformer. And you can see that it was drilled with a 5,000-foot lateral with 250-foot stage spacing. But operator B decided to be more aggressive with their completion and their stimulation design, and they put their stages closer together. So there's more frac density for operator B, but the laterals were roughly the same. So what we did is, after we looked at the performance data for operator A, we characterized the rock, we just changed the stage density in the model. And lo and behold, we got the same performance as those 2 operator B wells, assuming the same configuration. Then we looked at that 8,000-foot lateral, and we decided, okay, well, what if we kept that stage density that we just changed and we made an extended reach lateral to 8,000 feet? Bang, it's like right on top of it. This is real data. So in this case, it's absolutely apples to apples across the board. Operator A and operator B can achieve the same well performance results if they do the same well completion design. Now, in this particular project, there were other slight little changes to initial water saturation, slight variations in petrophysics, but the RTA could account for all of that as well. These weren't the dominant variables. The completion detail was the dominant variable, which is why we're presenting it, but it did normalize other things as well. So we're done for part A. Now let's get into the exciting stuff that we're really, we can't wait to share. This is the integrated work that we've been doing lately. So everything for the next 5 case studies, you're going to see a variety of things. The first is going to be looking at how we can achieve a better understanding of effective frac description by coupling fracture modeling with RTA in our workflow. Bob Pearson last week approached the mic and asked Adam, how are you doing your conductivity cutoffs? Like, what are you talking about what the appropriate conductivity cutoff is from a frac model to get an effective length or an effective height? I'm going to show you. We're going to do that in the Wolfcamp. The next is going to be well spacing optimization, and it's a frac modeling RTA dance as well that shows the application of using the latest developed numerical modeling tools in commercial software to show how quickly we can do numerical modeling and come up with an understanding of optimizing number of wells per drilling spacing unit, block, or section. That's Sprayberry. Then we're going to identify the ideal targeting landing depth for one operator in the Cardium. We'll go on to show how RTA and integrated studies can be used to validate petrophysics in the Wolfcamp, and we'll finish with cluster effectiveness, because this is going to lead into Dave's talk next week, which is how the role of completion technology will drive our industry forward. So it's really fitting and suitable to end on a talk about the role of completion effectiveness. Okay, so this is it. This is our simplified integrated workflow. With this workflow, we start with petrophysics. And core analysis. We'll start with open hole log interpretations and core calibrated log interpretations to extract the formation properties. Porosity, perm, saturation, net pay, these are values that go into rate transient analysis. But also Young's modulus, Poisson's ratio, this is the feedstock for frac modeling. So the geosciences are really in charge of what the results are going to be for our workflows. This then, of course, coupled with frac modeling to get some frac properties using a workflow that I'll get into, that gives us frac length, heights, conductivities, and stimulation efficiencies or effectiveness. All of that will then be going into production modeling, which is the general term that we'll use, but rate transient analysis is what we do to do our reservoir descriptions for forecasts. So we're excited because this is a procedure that's always integrating and iterating results with a really short feedback loop. It provides an immediate response to us. We work in a very agile way in our team to ensure a very efficient and consistent workflow. It's a real practical approach, we believe, for small and large well counts. And we've performed this anything from 1 well to tens of wells. So frac modeling and RTA go together really good. We'll start with an overview looking at the Wolfcamp in the Midland Basin. This case study features 1 horizontal pinpoint completed oil well. This study is going to demonstrate how we can tightly couple our frac modeling and production modeling results to understand effective frac geometry. It's also going to, and this is going to be a real cool part of this case study that I think Adam might have even alluded to last week, is it's going to illustrate how we can integrate post-treatment, after closure, frac modeling results. A lot of people take their frac modeling results as soon as we've done pumping. Here's your description. We ran this thing a little bit longer, and we saw some interesting results that we'll share. So this is the table that we typically present in our workflows for different effective frac geometry descriptions from the frac modeling output based on different fracture conductivity cutoffs. And here we can see cutoffs ranging from 1 to 10 millidarcy feet. And with the lower cutoff, of course, you get a bigger frac. You get taller frac. You get a longer frac. And you also have you can express the conductivity as a dimensionless parameter too, which is the last column. So which one of these do we use? How do we know what the suitable conductivity cutoff is in terms of the effective frac property? Well, we're going to use numerical modeling to answer this. So assuming the very first row that we looked at on that table, we used a frac conductivity of cutoff of 1 millidarcy feet, giving us the most optimistic looking fracture for height and length. We got a frac height of a couple hundred feet and a frac half length of 150 feet. And we have what we would consider to be a good or acceptable history match of all 3 phases. Or in this case, what we're doing is we're using the oil rate to match on the gas rate, match on the water rate, and history match the bottom hole flowing pressure. You'll notice that there's a mismatch on the water rate to begin with, but that's just frac fluid load recovery. You can see in the late time data we start matching it. So we call this a good match, and it's valid. What about a cutoff of 6 millidarcy feet? Would you call this a good match? This is right at the point where we would say no, because we're starting to lose our match on gas rate. And this comes with a lot of iterations, a lot of changes to relative permeability curves and fine-tuning parameters. There's a little bit of monkeying around in here to come up with what we would consider our best possible match as a group. But at this point, we would say from this point on, we're not getting good matches. And to illustrate the point more severely, using a cutoff of 10 millidarcy feet, no matter what we do to this model, we can't history match using this frac description. So the numerical modeling really reveals which of these frac descriptions are permissible or are still considered valid in the solution space and which ones aren't. So taking a look at the table again, we've just popped out a whole bunch of these potential descriptions as invalid. And now we're just dealing with conductivity cutoffs of 5 to 1. So if we want to plot these things, and here we're looking at an XY plot of connected pay to fracture half length, which is a nice way of looking at the data to get a sense of height and length. The connected pay is something I think I should talk about a little bit. So what we get for the frac model is a frac height. And whatever the frac penetrates effectively, that might not be a net to gross of 1. So what we would do is find out where the frac went and then understand the net pay in the area where the fracture has contacted. And in that sense, we talk about the connected net pay from the fracture treatment. Anyway, we're still down to these 5 runs. How do we hone in on our description further? Well, should frac modeling results, meaning XF, HF, and KFW, be interpreted at the end of frac treatment? This is what I was alluding to at the opening of the case study. Can we learn something from running these frac models a little bit longer? In this case, the fracture closure time was a really big number. I want to say it was like 19 or 20 hours. And yet, the proppant that was being carried in a viscous fluid, well, that would break within a couple hours. So what we were seeing is, from the frac modeling results that is that the sand was settling. And I've got a couple videos here to show you this. I see somebody smiling and nodding, so they've seen this kind of stuff before. So the conductivity is dynamic. It changes through time. We all know that through production. But, I mean, even in 12 hours after pumping, it's dynamic. So we're going to see what it looks like running it 12 hours later. So I'll hit play here, just if I can get rid of my laser pointer. So you can see it going, treating. This is proppant concentration, heat map through time there. We stopped pumping. We got that nice cross through the X, which is where the well is landed. So this is just running this thing, and the pumps have stopped. You can watch the proppant concentration. It's still moving into the reservoir, of course. Now watch what happens here. This is dramatic. So we can watch the sand settling. Again, large closure time, but viscosity is broken. Now, fracture description would you assume now for rate transient analysis or production modeling when the swell is under producing conditions under effective stress, when we lower flowing pressure into increased gas rate? Like what is your XF, what is your H, right? So what we found, before we even started seeing these results, what we found is using the H values that are supplied by the operating company, in some cases 250, 300 feet, it didn't make any sense to the data. We would history match these wells, and we'd come up with permeabilities in the nanodarcy for plays like the Cardium, or what would be characterized as plays with tens of microdarcies or higher. How did that make any sense? Well, it's because our H's were too big. And we've realized that as we've integrated with other sciences and technologies. We've really come to understand that H isn't as big as we'd like to think it is. In the old days, we would just have an H value, and it would be what the petrophysicist would say, and say, here's your H, it's 300 feet. You know, we're targeting these plays these days with really gross pay intervals. And the question is that our pay? Well, yeah, that's our pay. And in RTA, it has H, so I guess that's what I put in there. But that's, in the world of unconventionals, that just doesn't make sense, because the numbers that we regress to, permeabilities, fracture areas, they don't make any sense. They don't correlate with the other results or calibrate well with the other results that we're getting. So this is just a really good illustration, and this is one of many different things that could be telling us why our H values are too small, are too big, that we need to lower them. In this case, if you look at what the height is, I mean, a better number for H now in looking at this well might be 100 feet. Looking at conductivity, or maybe it's a little bit bigger, I can't see the scale here, but looking at let's see. Looking at conductivity, you're going to see the same story. Very similar story. Okay, pumping. Well, I think it's already done. Part of it's scaling. This is 0 to 25 millidarcy feet, so it's hard to see what the lower conductivity ranges are as far away from the wellbore. But you can see that as the sand is falling, so is the conductivity. And we're getting ourselves, by the end of this video, 12 hours after the pump stop, of what we would think is the best, most conductive region for this well, you know, assuming that our inputs are good. And this is what we've got. So this, for us, this is very, very telling. And this is why we know we always try to do frac modeling in what we do. So now this is what we have for valid models. And we recognize that these are simple models, that they impose things like, you know, homogenized properties, uniform frac descriptions, and we know from our surveillance community that it's not as simple as that. But for engineering workflows to conduct optimized well spacing, this really enhances our understanding in order to carry out those exercises. Our 7th track is called Well spacing optimization. So this is Spindletop, Texas, over 100 years ago. So obviously not optimized here in this case. So this is a 7 plug and perf well pad in an oil reservoir with complex multi-phase fluid behavior. So obviously that lends itself to numerical modeling. And what you're going to see is some really amazing developments from one company that is a vendor of rate transient analysis and what they've done to enhance their numerical modeling capabilities. In this study, RTA is used to calculate 30-year EURs and recovery factors as a function of well spacing. And I did this for a dear friend of mine. And he worked at a company. He just started there, and he was the manager of the asset team. And he wanted to communicate what reserves could look like as we downspace or space wells far apart, and also get a sense for recovery factor, especially recovery factor when you're looking at PUD locations and you just apply recovery factors to volumetrics. So this is I'm about to show you what the results look like. Here we go. My buddy said that the economics dictated at this company that he needed to see 500,000 barrels per well for a 30-year EUR on each of these wells. How many wells can I drill given that objective function? So we took this recently developed numerical modeling, which is super slick and fast, and we created what would have taken us a month or so to create results in a matter of a few days. And that would have been a very painful month, if not longer. And here you're seeing every little dot on that map is a different numerical simulation run. So what we did is, for this particular, well, you're seeing all 7 wells on the pad here. And you can see that for a different number of wells per section, that's really just different drainage areas, different well spacing scenarios. So that's why you're seeing some dots that are between 7 and 8 or 8 or 9, because it's really just a drainage area. And what you're seeing is eventually you get so heavily downspaced, your wells are so close together, say 8 wells per section, or that's what, 80 acres per well, that you're seeing that the EURs per well go down. Overall recovery in the section goes up, so maybe it's not presented in the way that you would think. But on a per well basis, of course, you start getting into competing drainage between wells when the wells are too tightly spaced. So to answer his question, 6 wells per section is the point where your average is about 500,000 barrels, and you start going lower than that. But he also said, our objective is to get at least a 13% recovery factor out of this field. How many wells per section do I need to answer that question? Well, that's a different number. That's 7 wells per section as an average. So just taking those forecasts and relating them to the volume they're assigned to drain for recovery factor, at 6 wells per section, we're seeing 11.2% recovery factor as an average. And if we want 13, we need 7 wells per section. So this is how we can do these exercises fairly quickly. And again, this would have taken us forever if we had to do this a couple years ago. So track 8, targeting optimal landing depth. We're going back to the Cardium for this case study. This is one pinpoint completed oil well. In this case, this was a great story. The operator had this awesome looking petrophysical log, and there was other operators in the area that were making good wells. But they had some wells that were underperformers, and they couldn't understand why. The geology was very favorable. The landing depth that they chose was, as most people choose, you target good porosity, right? I mean, you go for the best looking porosity and the best rock. Well, that's good, but the frac modeling that we performed, again post-mortem, indicated that there was a significant proppant settling below the well, that the frac was going down, and that the well was only partially connected with the targeted pay interval. So we weren't connecting the entire targeted pay interval. And our recommendation was made to lower the landing depth to the bottom third of the interval. So this is what the log looked like. It was really, really good. 12.5 meters of pay using an 8% porosity cutoff and other cutoffs. It was good-looking geology. The frac modeling results were showing, now in this case it was I put how the job was conducted. It's a slick water, 30-50 sand. We're seeing that the slick wasn't able to carry this stuff up very well. We're seeing that the sand dropped, and not only did it drop, but we're seeing that the fracture from the results showed a very poor connection. After we're more than a couple meters down, there's a bit of a gap, as you can see there in the illustration in the bottom image, and then the conductivity, or the sand concentration in this case, kind of gets big again. So we don't really know what to use for H now in our models, but we know 12.5 it doesn't make sense. And we can confirm that by using 12.5 meters and coming up with, like I said, nanodarcy permeability in the cardium. So there was a lot of inconsistencies there. But if we see this net pay as 2 meters or 6 meters, somewhere in there, we're seeing a really good result where everything is more consistent. This is an image of a numerical model of performing that match, using oil rate to match on gas, water, and pressure, like we did last time. And in this particular example, we tried to give them as much net pay as we possibly could. We gave them the 6 meters and just said, okay, well, maybe that disconnection isn't that bad, and maybe we can get at least 6 meters on this well. Well, to match the data, we're going to come out with permeabilities of 65 microdarcies near the frac and a matrix perm of about 10 microdarcies absolute perm away. Is that reasonable? Well, that's maybe not. Maybe that's even still a little too tight, but maybe the net pay is even lower than 6 meters. But this is the exercise and the iterations that we do. We would say this is the most oil in place we could assign to this well. New track, validating petrophysics. So this is the short iteration loop between the petrophysical analysis and the rate transient analysis engineer. Back into Texas, Delaware Basin Wolfcamp study. This one we just did. It's a 5 plug and perf well study. When we started the study, this wasn't even one of the objectives. It's just something that popped out of the data. This isn't an uncommon story either, by the way. The operator assumed a very low initial water saturation. And so that means a very good gas or oil saturation. That's the corollary there. So RTA modeling demonstrated that this value is too low. So the water cut that we're seeing on these wells was 75% water cut with a 35% initial water saturation. There's a bit of a disconnect there. So what we tried to do is we modeled these things, and we did ridiculous things to rel perm curves to make this work to start. And you'll see what we had to do. But using a reasonable set of rel perm curves, and we increased the SWI by 10%, everybody's happy, everything makes sense. The implications for this, though, are very significant, of course. If this is the case across the entire field, we're changing that pore, and we're saying 10% of what you thought was oil is water. So that just doesn't change oil in place and reserves. Implications there. It also means that with more water, you've lowered your compressibility term, because water is not as compressible as oil, and that's going to affect the drive mechanism to achieve a high recovery factor. So there's a double whammy in that. Here's the producing water cut for all wells, 75%. Validating the initial water saturation, well, like I said, we could match it, but assuming an irreducible water saturation of 0%. Does that make sense? Probably not. So we can get a history match, but is that reasonable? Yeah, I'd say no. But we definitely did do that. Then we did another way, and we said, okay, what about still a fairly conservative irreducible water saturation of 14%, still what most would consider low? Well, we need to increase initial water saturation to 45% to match, to come up with the equivalent water match. And once again, we're not matching flush production water, because even if you do a flowback program, there's still some frac fluid recovery. We're not trying to history match the first month or two. But after a while, it's just a question of when we want to start matching the well performance, the water rate trend. So what we're saying here is if you're padding your numbers, we're going to find out, right? We're going to see that in our work. So moving on to the last case study, cluster effectiveness. This is a big study that we did last year. It's 12 liquids-rich horizontal gas wells in the Montney. 5 wells were done with pinpoint technology, which were the wells most recently spud. 5 were plug and perf, which was what the completion technology they used just before pinpoint. And before they even showed up, there was open hole ball drops in the play. So we had logs, core analysis, frac modeling, and RTA, all integrated for reservoir characterization and completion design understandings. Constrained to all data and information, the cluster effectiveness from this study was revealed that the plug and perfs ranged from 32 to 62% cluster efficiency or effectiveness. Of course, the pinpoint wells were 100% efficient, just by the nature of the technology. So let's talk about, these are integrated case studies, and this is, I'm trying to say that they're all slightly different. In this case, the slight difference here is the core analysis that we're bringing in. This was under confining pressure. Of course, under confining pressure, is going to lower the permeability from the core analysis. And this is what we believe is the most reflective value for in situ permeability conditions for doing production modeling. Here we can see that the results, permeability results, and these are 18 samples plotted on the x-axis, we're seeing that most of the perm results under confining pressure on the core is around 100 nanodarcies. And this is the basis of using 100 nanodarcies in our decisions for using that as a constraining parameter for modeling. Now also with frac modeling, we did frac modeling both on the plug and perf design and the pinpoint, and here's just an example of a single stage with both methods. Here you can see that on the plug and perf side, we're seeing only 2 out of the 3 clusters on a stage are actually effective, and those clusters give fairly different looking frac geometries. One's long and skinny, or one's long and sort of small height, one's a big height, shorter. And one's pinched off. One is stress shadowed right out. This isn't new to anybody here. I'm sure that everybody's very familiar with the countless papers in the literature from all the service companies and many operators that talk about the inefficiencies, lateral stimulation efficiencies of this particular technology. Pinpoint, however, this is, I mean, we're just dealing with 100% stimulation efficiency every time. So there's really no need to show things that pinch out because they just don't. Doing simplified rate transient analysis on the plug and perf well example, we can see a couple things diagnostically in the well performance data that gives us an indication of an ineffective stimulation design. These are not common signatures, I'm not going to say. This isn't characteristic of plug and perf, but this is a good one that I wanted to show of what looks like a poorly effective, a bad frac, I guess, a short frac. In the top left-hand plot, you're looking at linear flow as indicated by a straight line relationship on that glorified square root time plot. But what's happening in the data, which isn't a common behavior, is that the data we're used to it hooking up, you know, but in this case it's hooking down. What could that be? Well, our interpretation is that that is linear flow going into pseudo-radial flow, in the sense that the completion is acting like a choke, that the fracture is not accessing enough of the rock that it needs to, and that there is a rapid transition from linear to pseudo-radial, which can be achieved from a well that doesn't have fractures that extend effectively deeply into the reservoir. And that cartoon can be sort of captured in the bottom right-hand corner there, which is again a very overly simplified understanding of looking at the completion and seeing that the fracs are far apart because of inefficiencies in the stimulation, and of course the onset of pseudo-radial flow around those fracture faces is inevitable with that type of configuration. The type curve analysis work, beyond the simplified analysis that you saw on that dashboard previously, confirms the same thing in terms of efficiencies. The efficiencies are confirmed, and this is the critical part, the efficiencies are confirmed through the permeability constraint that we're using from our confining pressure core analysis results. If we assume that the perm is 100 feet, there's only a certain number of NF, or number of fractures, that can be achieved while creating a suitable history match. And this is what we do to, at a very high level, in a very simple way, arrive at an understanding of frac efficiency. What we would love to do is connect those to surveillance information, like production logging tool, fiber optics tracers, something that gives us an indication of flow proportion, so that we can validate these techniques. And we do have some experiences with this, but not a lot. Our interpretation here is that, yeah, there was poor efficiencies across the lateral in this particular example, this being the worst one. The analytical model that we showed here on history matching the plug and perf, this is a more rigorous form of interpretation than the analysis. It gives us a little bit more flexibility and more parameters to play with. We're seeing perms of 100 nanodarcy as our constraint, but once again, as with the case of the analysis, a 50% frac efficiency across the lateral. So that's it for case studies. Final thoughts. The well performance data that we have can provide great insights into underlying reservoir and completion characteristics, and is widely available and very inexpensive, so why not use it? RTA is an excellent tool for forcing consistency among many disparate sources of oil field data. This includes all the things that I was showing you before, bringing in the frac models, the surveillance, microseismics, all of it, and trying to come up with a really good holistic understanding of what the data and the information is telling us. So we drink the Kool-Aid. We're on board with that as philosophically for how we approach subsurface oil and gas problems. RTA has evolved since I've started from being a standalone tool with basic inputs where we work absolutely in a silo where I'm given petrophysical parameters, starting in the days of Fouquet Associates where we were just handed our petrophysics, we plugged them in, we did some type curve work, here's your answer, and this is what we did to promote rate transient analysis workflows in industry. And now in the world of unconventionals, well, that still works very well in conventional reservoir engineering. In the advent of unconventionals, we recognize that in order to really get a better understanding of what we're doing for reservoir characterization, we must be working together and like breaking down the office doors and making sure that as we're building our models, as we're interpreting the properties and the information, that we're collaborating in an integrated way. And we can see industry all over the place doing asset teamwork, where this is the philosophy that large E&Ps are operating with, and even smaller ones. And I hope that we sort of continue in this way because we're all learning a lot more than just being specialists in our areas of core competencies. And I'm really happy to say that I'm no longer just a one-trick RTA pony, that it's been a really exciting ride these last couple of years as we've had new conversations, we've learned about completion technology, we've learned about frac design, we've talked about the geosciences, and it's the most exciting it's ever been for me in my career right now. So I'm hoping that those things continue, and I'm hoping that people recognize that through some of these case studies that we all sort of believe that this is a very practical way to approach well performance analysis and integrated asset workflows so that we can come up with decisions fairly quickly. With that, I'll say, oh, sorry, one more slide. I forgot about that. I put this together rather quickly, so I don't even know what's coming here. RTA has enabled engineers to identify the following: upside reserves potential, dominant drive mechanisms in the reservoir, effective versus ineffective completions, the optimal completion design by using a rigorous benchmarking procedure, production optimization opportunities, things like workover candidates, optimum well spacing done in a very efficient way, and identifying inconsistencies with other data from what the completion engineers or geosciences are telling us, making sure that it's all wrapped together and it all makes sense. So with that, I will say thank you very much. I hope you like that, Chad. That's for you, buddy. Yeah.
Thank you, John. If there's any questions for John, and I imagine there's a lot, can you please come up and use this mic so we can capture on the live stream there. So please come forward and ask any questions you have, John.
Hi, John. Thank you so much. Claudio Viros with Nexen. Just have a question about reserves, like how you are feeling that the reserves auditors are looking at these workflows, and can you comment on that?
So how the reserves evaluation community is looking at these workflows, that's the question? Okay. It varies. I'm pleased to say that through recent conversations I've had with a few companies that I won't name by name, that they recognize the value in rate transient analysis for reserves. The way I see it being conducted in a practical way, and I will name drop here, and I'll say my buddy Dilhan Ilk, who works at D&M, in a conversation I had with him a few years ago, he really captured it well for me. He said that the way we do things is we'll get reserves on many, many wells, hundreds of wells, and what we'll do is I will look at a subset of the wells where they've done rate transient analysis work on for reserves, irrespective of the tool that they use, because Dilhan is fluent in all commercial software for this, for RTA. And so he'll go in and he'll go, for the operating companies that want to use it, in plays, particularly plays with not a lot of production history, where RTA excels at demonstrating defensible higher reserves than you'll get through rule of thumb practices, traditional practices for say, shale plays, that he'll do it on a subset of wells, tens of wells, and if it all checks out and he says that they're reasonably done, he just stamps and approves the rest of them, right? Hopefully I'm allowed to say that, Dilhan, if you hear this. But that makes sense, and I don't think everybody is as forward-thinking as that particular shop or individual. I've certainly seen a lot of people who don't adopt it, or they feel that they can't, because the resources required, while I call it practical for us, and I do, there's two main issues of why it hasn't already gone mainstream across the board, is this is the way it's done. One is time. Like it's not forever, but it does take longer, right? And that's an issue. The second that Dr. John Lee highlighted a couple years ago is the fact that it is not, I don't want to use the word ambiguous. That's maybe too hard of a word, but from one practitioner to the next, you might come up with very different looking answers using RTA as a tool for reserves, right? And so it's coming up with a standardized way where if you do it or I do it, it comes out with the same answer. And so it suffers from that. And the companies that I've talked to, in fact, we have a strategic alliance with a reserves company right now, and the conversation is, well, we love the science, we believe in what you're doing, but we only believe the experts should be doing it. Right? Like if we don't want to hire some intern or some EIT to do RTA and to bastardize the science and come up with a stupid number. It needs to be done from trained people who have experience. And I can appreciate that sentiment as well. So for us, it's not complicated, but we've been doing it every single day, in my case for a decade, in Dave's case 2 decades. So yeah, like we're okay with it. But I understand those challenges. So I think if industry understands that they can justify higher reserves with limited data to their stockholders and increase their share price, that they might get motivated to do it. As a result of that, that's how we get busy. I mean, Dave, our department gets work from people that are tasking us to come up with defensible reserve audit trails. And that was the large part of the success that we had at FICAT. So that's a long-winded way of saying it's coming through time. Some companies are more forward-thinking than others, but I'm happy to say that I've seen a slow progression towards using it, not across all the wells that they have in their portfolio, but on a subset of wells, and using it for type curve work. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but.
Any more questions for John? Well, with that, I think I'd like to thank you, John, for putting on a great talk. And on behalf of SPE, the magic blue bag that's got something in it.
Thank you very much,
That will
Frank.
really enhance your coffee tasting pleasure.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thanks, Frank. Thank you very much.